Thanks so much, Kirsten. Okay, yes, I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose lands and waters I'm beaming in at you today. And I'm going to be very quick because I worry this paper is quite long, but it's basically a paper that comes out of a book that's going to be published next year. That's a collection of 8 life stories. In fact, there's 2 books. They both come from breach of promise of marriage cases. One is a collection of 8 life stories or legal biographies, and this is one of those that come from the actions starting in 1806, which was when the first action was taken, through to 1975 when it was abolished. The first book, I use these, kind of go into the cases themselves and try to uncover the life stories of the litigants. And then the second book is a kind of synoptic overview that ultimately, tells a story about the legal regulation of love, and in its broad arc, the way that the governance of love shifts from law to psychology by the time you get to sort of 1975. It's not a teleological history. It's quite critical of that kind of shift. And part of the joy of writing it is that the archives are divine. Can you see, if you can see my screen, we get all these lovely writs, affidavits, blah blah, and also love letters often tumble out of them, out of my archives, and end up forming a big part of this action. Just to give you a quick overview of the action itself, you could sue someone for breaking their promise to marry you. Up until 1975, you had to prove firstly that there was a promise, which fell under the realm of contract law. So, did they promise you? It didn't have to be written. It was often just behavioural, and then you had to show that there was a breach of that, and that breach wasn't merited. So one of the defences to it was that you were unchaste or that you had levity of conduct, which is what we find in this case. Okay, so on the 3rd of January 1833, Michael Steele, a 39-year-old man of very considerable property, slipped a note into the hand of his lodger, the 17-year-old Sarah Hawthorne. "My dear Sarah," he wrote, "I hope that I will have the great gratification of meeting you in the garden tonight. I do long so much for a little of your sweet company, and my foot is so bad I'm not able to walk in the paddock. Quite devoted to your kind affections, your devoted lover, Michael Steele." 18-year-old Sarah received the letter during the 3 months that she lodged in Michael's 2-storey terrace in Hobart with her widowed mother Jane and her brother John. Lodging with a suitor could have been very convenient, except that Michael insisted on secrecy. Sarah's brother first noticed their affections when the 2 families took a Sunday walk to the government garden. Their behaviour, he later told the courtroom, could not be mistaken. She leant on Mr. Steele's arm, and after they returned, they went to Mr. Steele's parlour for some wine. As a lodger, Sarah had the perfect excuse to see Michael whenever she wished, although her giddiness could betray her. Recalling the night spent drinking in the parlour, one family friend told the jury, "I heard Miss Hawthorne laugh immoderately, such that Jane was ashamed of her conduct," quote unquote. In the last letter that Michael sent to Sarah, he declined her invitation to go on an excursion, but promised something far more serious. "My dear Sarah, I'm sorry I cannot accompany you to Sandy Bay today, but you have all my affections and I do intend to make you my lawful wife. I am your affectionate lover, Michael Steele." Now, if Sarah had read any romance literature, she would have known to beware a lover who demands secrecy. Male tyranny and sexual entitlement flourish in dark places. This is why courtship conventions stipulated that Michael ask Sarah's family for permission to begin courting her. But Sarah was young and probably delighted in the attention of a wealthy man. A few days after receiving the letter, Sarah told her brother John of the courtship, and he indignantly demanded a meeting in the garden with Michael. "I never had any intentions of marrying your sister," Michael confessed to him. "What I did was merely out of a lark." John was furious. "You've behaved in a most dishonourable manner," he said. "The girl is my sister, and so it's my duty to question you on the subject. She has no father, and I'm her only protector." The next day, John consulted a lawyer who issued a writ for breach of promise of marriage, and almost immediately, rumours about Sarah began to spirit out of the Steele residence. She spent all her time in the kitchen flirting with the servant men. She laughed immoderately during drinks in the parlour. She stormed off after a fight with her brother to go and live with a friend, Mrs. Donahue. 3 months later, the gossip wound its way into the breach of promise action. Breach of promise was one of the only actions that allowed for hearsay evidence. So you constantly had, gossip sort of, arriving in court, character kind of, assessments. Anyway, the jury and the assessors in this case, or the assessors in this case, chose not to believe it. Michael Steele, as the prosecution argued, did not possess one spark of honour or humanity. With a burst of applause from the gallery, they declared a verdict for Sarah of £200, which was double the average amount for the century, based upon Michael's houses and his many splendid acres. If you sue a wealthy guy, you're more likely to get big damages. So Hawthorne versus Steele was the first breach of promise case brought in Tasmania, and its timing in the early 1830s is significant. This was a period that witnessed a concerted effort by colonial authorities and new emigrants to convert the gloomy prison of Van Diemen's Land into the respectable home of Tasmania. Big footnote, obviously, to James Boyce and various scholars. From the 1820s to 1840s, free emigrants from the respectable lower and middling orders, many funded by government assistance schemes, flooded into Hobart, transforming it from an authoritarian penal colony to a cosmopolitan port city. The moral legitimacy of their claims to civil rights, and we see this here, as well as their dignity, depended on shaking off the colony's reputation as a place of convict vice and sexual disorder. Marriage was crucial to reforming the colony's dubious reputation. And to this end, the courts used the action to teach settlers to respect the sanctity of a proposal. We might also note, however, that the Steele case is told through commentary on gardens, kitchens, parlours, paddocks, and vast property empires. This is a story about the geography of intimacy at every level, from the minutiae of a woman's laugh in a parlour to the allure of a property gentleman. Firstly, we can see how a lodging house owned by a man tipped bourgeois courtship conventions on their head. Sarah could not consent to Michael's visits, and nor did Michael have to ask Sarah's family for permission to see her, as would usually be the case. They're already in the one house. Impoverished women like Sarah did not have the same power to control male access to intimate places, nor the tempo of the courtship as bourgeois women did. It also meant that women like Sarah could take more initiative in seeing their lovers, such as inviting them on excursions, slipping downstairs to see them, which could then threaten their sexual reputations. And because sheltering women under the paternal roof meant protecting them from predatorial sexuality, male owners of lodging houses made uneasy suitors. Panning out from the home, we also see the legal significance of land. Stroll through paddocks appear as legal proof of courtship, and gardens function as quasi-legal spaces for contractual negotiation. Property was not something that couples transcended through love, but was at the core of romance. The most eligible bachelors, like Michael Steele, owned land, and women like Sarah sued for loss of settlement, the worth of Michael's home, investments, and landed interests. In a strictly legal sense, settlement in breach of promise meant the economic and social status that came with being mistress of a home. For those whose land was being settled, obviously, it meant the diametric opposite: invasion of the home, loss of livelihood, disruption of social order, and fragmentation of family, perpetual movement to avoid being captured or killed. In settler colonial societies, to settle, as many people have now said, meant to unsettle. So if Sarah fancied Michael Steele because of his properties, much as Lizzie Bennet loved Darcy for Pemberley, then the question we might need to ask in settler colonial nations is, what if Pemberley was stolen? What violent reality lay behind the romantic appeal of the property gentleman in Tasmania and Australia in general? Keeping the focus on the geography of desire, I want to follow the property gentleman in this story from England to Tasmania, from his properties and his parlour rooms to his kitchens and gardens, to show the links between propriety and property, to reveal how love, land and lucre were entangled. So Michael Steele was the son of a yeoman from Gloucestershire, and he arrived in Hobart Town in 1823 with his sister Jane Steele. Steele family weren't poor, and Michael and Jane could have had quite a happy life in the middling orders of rural England. But at 28 years of age, Michael was restless, filled with dreams of pluck, plenty and family prestige. Unlike England, where he said that he was oppressed by feudal tithes and taxes, there's an amazing archive of the Steele family in Melbourne Uni archives that Gwyneth and Hume Dow found and sort of put together. So he says, you know, oppressed by feudal tithes and taxes in England, whereas from the 1820s, the Australian colonies offered free land grants to settlers based upon the amount of capital that they were able to show. So with £30,000, Michael was given 20,000 acres, which was the most that the government were willing to give at the time, and 20 convict labourers as well. Within 3 years, he's able to boast that he had already 3,000 sheep on his property in the northeast of Tasmania, near the River Clyde. And he told the Surveyor General in the same year that he'd completed a good and substantial farmhouse, fenced about 100 acres, planned a barn and sown English grasses. Michael did not just move from place to place, he altered the places in the interests of profit. And he did so, he thought, with the stamp of divine approval. Providence, he mused in 1830, had been bountiful. Michael never questioned whether the original owners might have a better claim on the land that he was gifted. In February 1827, he described being on his property when he was told that 4 white men had been attacked by natives. I instantly armed all my men, some on horseback and some on foot, and set out to find them, but they were not to be seen, he wrote. The next day, we fell in with them on top of a mountain and poured a strong fire into them, killed their leader and 1 more. They dropped everything and fled. Had the country been even and clear, we should have killed or taken the whole of them. So cowardly are these vagabonds when attacked by bold Englishmen. From here, the letter then drifts nonchalantly into sheep farming, noting that he thought that he'd made quite a lot of money by now, with 2,000 ewes of all ages on the farm this season, having 40 rams amongst them. And so Michael concludes the story of murder with rams, a term that he also uses for sons or heirs when he's writing to his brother. It's a slippage that I find evocative when thinking through the intimacy and the violence of settler rule, when trying to understand how he could write so blithely of killing. To colonise, you needed at base to dispossess the original inhabitants of their land and repopulate it with Europeans. You needed property and progeny, and Michael was committed to both. Frontier violence increased rapidly in the 1820s because new kinds of Britons like Michael began disembarking from the pier in Hobart, free settlers interested in building their wealth and status through sprawling property empires. Prior to the 1820s, as Boyce has explained, most Europeans in Tasmania were convicts from the industrial and rural poor in Europe who did not claim exclusive possession of the land. There was conflict with Indigenous people, but on the whole, says Boyce, it was a system of shared land use. Free settlers arrived with guns, small armies of assigned convicts, sheep and cattle, and a belief in the inviolability of private property, which resulted in an escalation of violence. Curiously, the land grants which sanctioned this violence did so through the language of love as much as law. Written in loopy Victorian era cursive, Michael's grant awarded him 2,000 acres, and I quote, to have and to hold. If Michael were to marry, he'd be rewarded with 20 acres more, and then another 10 acres for each child. The grant is a legal document whose vision is flung far into the future, dynastic, imagining a new white society comprised of married couples and families. Like a marital relationship, to have and to hold land meant to exercise exclusive possession of the property. It was a sacred, inviolable bond. The law guaranteed a man's right to his property, be it his family, his wife, his home, or his land. And like a bride-to-be, the land was imagined as virgin, awaiting cultivation and existing to bear fruit. To essay our fortunes in the wilderness, which our labour and enterprise alone could render habitable, was how Michael described his vision of Tasmania upon quitting England. The law shared this fantasy of wilderness, and being written in a language of intimacy, the land grant both sanctioned and denied violence. Sanctioned because it conceived of Aboriginal people as trespassers and gave the owner a right to their property, and denied because in the Victorian imaginary, love was incompatible with violence. When violence enters a family estate, says 19th century critic John Ruskin, it is no longer home. That we're 21st century heirs of this 19th century vision may be part of the reason why we find it difficult to think of massacres and marriages in one breath. The grant, like Michael, was also utterly disinterested in the earth itself. I pored over Michael's letters, hoping to find some descriptions of his land in Tasmania, but he decided early on to employ overseers to manage his farms, and his letters are bereft of any feeling for the countryside. To this end, his sensibilities align perfectly with those of British property law, which had and still has surprisingly little to say about the physical characteristics of the land. For property law to be a useful instrument of empire, it needed to be nomadic and migratory, to be vacant of physical details, to ensure that the law of the land could be applied to any land, capable of travelling with Englishmen as they prowled the earth in search of a bargain. Michael's grant reimagines the textures of the earth as coordinates on a compass. The peppery aromas of a forest after rain, shadows spiriting across rocks, rolling vistas seen from the brow of a hill, and the rush of rivers and grasses are all obliterated, reduced to the chill certainty of numbers. North 25 degrees, northeast 25 degrees, west 44. In place of the earth, property law concerns itself with people and the relationships between them. Who owns it, who can sell it, who can inherit it. Aboriginal property laws, on the other hand, established a system of responsibility for the land based on knowledge of its physical attributes and farming practices, all of which created the grassy plains abundant with game that lured free settlers like Michael Still and his flocks of sheep in the first place. Nicole Graham's a great legal scholar who does property law, colonial histories of property law, and I'm quite indebted to her for her insights there. So while Michael's violence has received scholarly attention, his breach of promise action has not. Gwyneth and Hume Dow were scrupulous biographers who gathered an impressive archive pertaining to the Steele family to tell in their book, The Steele's Quest for Greener Pastures is what it's called. They tell a history of colonial class formation. Yet I find it odd that there's no mention of the hearing, given that it was covered in every single newspaper across the nation and was huge sort of at the time. It wouldn't surprise me if the breach of promise action was omitted because courtship was considered irrelevant to the serious business of capitalism and colonialism. In this paper, through attending to the geography of desire, my goal has been to argue against this and to show how land, love and law were engaged in an intimate frisson in settler societies. Love with the aid of law was a mode of spatial regulation, and conforming to its rules was a guarantee that white civilization in Tasmania looked civilized. That's it.